Three folks. Yeah.
It's gonna be cute. It's gonna be intimate. All right, stream is going. Huzzah. So now we are live on the New Mexico Venceremos Brigade page, as well as the APIP New Mexico YouTube channel and our Facebook channel. So if you're in front of your computer, why not share the live? And then just bear with me for a moment and we will get started. Thank you so much for everybody that registered and is joining us on the stream and in Zoom. Just want to share this stream to the Facebook event.
We're on now.
Cool. Done. Sweet. So yeah, I just wanted to put it in the Facebook event so that all the folks who said they were coming have a chance to see all of y'all and hear this incredible conversation. So greetings, everybody. My name is Onyesanu. I am an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party New Mexico chapter. I am also a member of the New Mexico Regional Committee of the Venceremos Brigade. There are a group of us that went to Cuba together last summer on the 50th anniversary of the Venceremos Brigade, the 50th anniversary delegation. We fell in love with Cuba. We learned quite a bit about revolution, about socialism, and also about how the country that we are citizens of attacks Cuba on a constant basis. And so when we got back, we decided to continue organizing together, form this regional committee, continuing to support and build the Venceremos Brigade. And also we decided that we wanted to tell the truth about Cuba to our respective communities. We represent African and Indigenous and Chicano communities here in Tiwa territory in the New Mexico Regional Committee of the Venceremos Brigade. And we want our people to know about the Cuban Revolution because it's a really incredible and important example for oppressed and colonized nations to learn from. So we are very, very happy that y'all are joining us this evening for this event, Unpacking US Attacks on the Cuban Revolution. Like I mentioned, ever since the Cuban people fought their revolution, won, and began to build a socialist society, the US government under both Democratic and Republican presidential administration has engaged in attacks, systemic attacks against the Cuban people and against the Cuban Revolution, attacks that are designed to make them turn away from the revolution, attacks that are designed to make them suffer collectively for the crime, the so-called crime of building socialism. And so tonight we want to talk about why that's happening, what those attacks look like, and also what we as people living in the United States, living in the belly of the beast, can do to show up in solidarity with the Cuban people, to show up in solidarity with the fight for justice and the fight for all of humanity and life on earth, which is the fight for socialism. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to my fellow brigadista, Sheldon, also a member of the New Mexico Venceremos Brigade Committee, as well as Pueblo Action Alliance here on Tiwa territory, to talk about the folks that we'll have talking to today.
Awesome. Thank you, Oni. Marahopa today Asakio Masuta Asan Suta. Hello everyone. Again, my name is Sheldon Tenorio, part of the New Mexico Venceremos Brigade Committee here on Tiwa territory. I'm a creative strategist with the Pueblo Action Alliance as well here in Tiwa territory. And yeah, I'll be your moderator today for the panel. We'll have folks introduce themselves as well and get into the rest of our programming with a couple questions. And also we'll be taking questions too from people tuning in, from people here on Zoom as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to put them in the live feeds and we'll make sure your questions are asked for our panelists. Yeah. First up, I would like to invite Roberto to introduce yourself, please.
Well, my name is Roberto Roybal. I'm currently living in Albuquerque. I'm originally from Santa Fe, Nuevo Mexico on Tiwa land. I work with the New Mexico Regional Committee of the Venceremos Brigade. I first started working with the regional committee back in 75 or 76, I can't remember, 77. I've been on the Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade almost 20 times, and I was on last year's 50th contingent. And I'm glad you're all joining us. We're going to see a lot more about what's going on in Cuba and how we can all work to support the Cuban Revolution. Thank you. Next, I'll pass it on to Malcolm.
Thank you, Roberto. Hello, everyone. My name is Malcolm. I take he, him pronouns. Speaking to you from Lenape and Canarsie territory in Brooklyn, New York. My day job, I'm a teacher in a high school here. And I've been working with the brigade, traveling to Cuba with the brigade, organizing in Cuba Solidarity and International Solidarity since 2009. Yeah, happy, honored to be here tonight with you. I could pass it.
Yeah.
Stella, take it away.
Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Stella. I use she, her pronouns. I am also calling from occupied Lenape and Canarsie land in Brooklyn. And I work as an administrative coordinator at a criminal and justice reform nonprofit called Just Leadership. And I have gone to Cuba twice, once with a separate group and once with the brigade last year for the 50th anniversary. And ever since we got back, have been following the brigade around to all their meetings and staying as involved as I can. And I'm really happy to be here with you all tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, y'all. I would like to invite Dr. Howard Ehrman to please introduce yourself, one of our panelists for tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks to Roberto and everybody else for inviting me. My name's Howard Ehrman. I'm here in Chicago right now. I've lived most of my life in Chicago, but not entirely. I got involved in the Venceremos Brigade in 1970. I was one of the organizers in the Midwest. And Roberto and I finally met each other at the 50th anniversary brigade last year. So I do work in health, but also in the political realm that's not just in health. So I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Awesome. Thank you, y'all. Appreciate everybody being here this evening, being here tonight. I'll go ahead and ask one of the first questions for this evening. And yeah, anybody who feels welcome to speak to this question right away, we can get into it. First question for tonight is, why is the U.S. attacking Cuba? Who feels called to answer this first question?
I'll start off then real quick.
Awesome.
U.S. attacking Cuba because it's a socialist country. They won the revolution in 1959, and we hold a grudge. And that's really the bottom line. They're a socialist country. They've been supported by other socialist countries around the world and continue to provide free education, health care, living wages to all its citizens in Cuba. Next.
I mean, it's in a way, it's very, I agree, obviously, with what Roberto said. It seems to be a combination of arrogance, that grudge that Roberto is speaking to, a kind of vengefulness out of the losses that, you know, the U.S. ruling class suffered when the revolution triumphed in 1959. But I also want to say, I mean, there's something kind of counterintuitive about the attacks, because economically it would be beneficial to the United States to stop attacking Cuba or to attack it in other ways, you know, to at least allow trade. There are plenty of economic interests in the United States that are in favor of opening up with Cuba, doing business with Cuba. So there is this kind of counterintuitive thing, right? If we think that most of the decisions here are made out of the motivation for profit, this one is not really that, at least as far as I could tell. It seems more this symbolic kind of thing. And I think part of it is also the fear of what Cuba symbolizes for working people, oppressed communities in this country. The other point I'll add real quick, and maybe somebody else could say more about it, is just the political reasoning around Florida and the Cuban American population in Florida that has historically supported a very hard line towards Cuba. And that's been a kind of constant justification for the US government to maintain the blockade, to maintain the attacks on Cuba, because they kind of depend on this voting bloc, even though even that rationale, I would say, is fading, if not gone already.
I'll just add, I agree with everything you both said, and I'll just add the word ego to all of that. And I think, what Malcolm's saying about it not making any sense economically is just proof to the almost emotional aspect of the grudge and the ego and the arrogance of the US not being willing to concede that they failed in colonizing Cuba. So that's all I'll add.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the way that US imperialism and colonialism acts is incredibly contradictory, like Malcolm and others have talked about. So this may sound kind of crazy to some people at the, but there is this whole thing about the blockade actually being very contradictory to what the goal of US imperialism is, right? So we know the goal of US imperialism is to crush the revolution that's been going on for 61 years in Cuba, and not only in Cuba, but to crush everything that Cuba does internationally, from the time it first went to Algeria in the early 60s to the support against the imperialists with the South Africa Namibian victory. I mean, the victory over the South Africans by Angola and Namibia, to what's going on now with the Venceremos Brigade, right? So it really expected Cuba to fold when the Soviet Union fell, and that did not happen. And it just, whatever else is going on, and I think the Florida piece is huge, doesn't realize that the blockade actually creates incredible unity among the Cuban people. It's terrible that it exists. People are dying every day in Cuba just from a health point of view because they can't get certain medication or equipment, and their lives are terrible in the sense of what the US is trying to do with them. However, their lives are also great in terms of the level of unity they have, the benefits that socialism has brought the people of Cuba, whether it's in education, health, and even in housing, in terms of there are problems still ongoing with housing, but the fact of the matter is nobody gets kicked out of a house or an apartment because of evictions or paying rent or mortgages. So I think that the US overall has actually helped the Cuban Revolution, even though it's hurt the Cuban people. So it's a big contradiction, but that's the fact. And when Cuba began to, the US began to open a little bit under Obama, it also creates contradictions inside the country, which are ongoing, and it's up to the Cubans to solve those.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, thank y'all. Appreciate it. Definitely agree with a lot of the answers here, especially the fact that, how the US can benefit, quote unquote, US can benefit from Cuba. Even myself, even having gone there, having had the experience to be there and learn and build with folks there on the ground in Cuba and learn about even the medical advances. There's been case by case by case by case, so many years of folks even traveling to Cuba and trying to learn and understand the advances in the medical fields, even with the treatments, the medical treatments happening, especially, and even providing, I wouldn't say was so much progress in the medical field, even when it comes to like diabetes and type 2 diabetes and different things of that sort. Even thinking of different times when indigenous nations also went over on different brigades or on different travels and wanted to learn and benefit and even create those relationships with Cuba as well. You know, not just there in the medical field, but everywhere. You know, even thinking about the setup, the structure. Even, you know, right now we're wrapped up too. Right now in the elections and voting, where in Cuba, you know, it's definitely set up in a different way, and this is why they won as well. Why I so love saying why the Cuban Revolution won. You know, it feels good to say that, to see U.S. imperialism fail. You know, and here's an example of that. And what can we learn? What can we build? And how can we exchange those ideas and those advances in a way that helps us? You know, and I've heard it myself being there as well. I've heard it myself from one of the Cuban doctors, literally saying that the U.S. blockade doesn't hurt Cuba, it hurts the U.S. It hurts the people there. And I definitely agree with that. And I definitely do that as well, even on a daily basis. Which also leads me into my second question for our panelists this evening is what do the attacks look like and how do they work? Malcolm spoke on it a little bit earlier, so I will, if it's cool, invite Malcolm maybe to start this off.
Sure. I mean, there's so much to say about what the attacks look like, because they're really far-reaching. But I mean, I think I'll just start by describing the blockade itself. That's what most of the attacks kind of fit into, this umbrella of the blockade that's been in place almost immediately following the triumph of the revolution. And I'll just make a quick note that it's a specific decision to use the word blockade. The Cubans are very adamant about describing the attack as a blockade, even though you'll see it written about, described as an embargo, for example, or as a program of sanctions. Right, and so when we think of a blockade, I think, you know, the kind of technical definition, we think back to 100 years ago when wars were fought with navies, and literally the Navy would encircle an island and physically blockade it, right? Not let anything in and out. And so that's kind of the legal argument where the US is saying, no, it's not a blockade, it's just an embargo. And every country has the right to enact a trade embargo where we say we're not going to trade with this country for whatever reason, right? Because we think it hurts our national interests or something. But when we talk about blockade, we're talking about an act of war. We're talking about an attempt to completely undermine and destabilize the Cuban economy, to prevent normal economic functioning in that country. And beyond that, to prevent normal economic relations between Cuba and the rest of the world. So the blockade is made up of many pieces, but primarily it's the rules around no trade between this country and Cuba, or no kinds of financial transactions between people here and people there. But then it's also it's got an extraterritorial aspect to it, as they say, where other countries can be punished by the US government for doing business with Cuba. So it also has this intention to discourage every other country on earth from dealing with Cuba, right? Because you'll face consequences from the US, right? I mean, millions of dollars are collected by the US government every year from like banks in Europe for doing financial transactions with Cuba, from companies in Canada. all of these kinds of things. And what was the other thing I wanted to say? I mean, just in the past year, I'll share a link in the chat in a minute, because there's a really beautiful summary, painful to read, but an excellent summary that was just published of just in the past year, the report on the impact of the blockade. It's $5 billion worth of losses for the Cuban economy. And it lists out, all these different areas where harm has been done. From the idea that part of the policy of the blockade is that Cuba cannot import any product that has more than 10% of it manufactured in the US, right? So talking about medical equipment or things, farming equipment, all kinds of machinery, right? It's like if the bolts or something were made in the US, they can't get it, right? Or they have to go in these roundabout ways in order to go through a third country and pay way more, right? In terms of food, right? Cuba, unfortunately, is still not able to produce enough food for the population, so they import a significant amount of food. But they can't import it from their neighbor, right? This country, which is so close by and which produces and wastes an incredible amount of food every year, right? So instead of getting rice from the South, from this land, right? They're going and getting rice from Vietnam, from China. You can imagine what this looks like in terms of increasing the costs. Fuel is a whole nother story. Culture even, right? I mean, just thinking about the fact that like Cuban music, Cuban movies, all of that can't be consumed here. I'll stop there because I could go on forever, but that, the blockade is this extremely far-reaching policy, and I'll come back later and talk more.
Oh, feel free to keep going. Going on. Stella, Howard, would you like to add anything?
Well, so I always like to look at the world positively, and even though we want the blockade to come down as quickly as possible, that it's actually made Cuba the most self-sufficient, country maybe in history, in my opinion. And that's not always a good thing, but it's good that Cuba's self-sufficient, but they can only do so much, right? I mean, anybody who's been in Cuba 5 minutes, once you step off the plane, even inside the airport at Jose Marti or wherever you go, you see evidence of this. And North Americans in particular like to say, oh, wow, look at that. Like they take, their gum and fix the, car so it runs again. Well, yes, that's good that they know how to do that, but they shouldn't have to be in that situation, right? I think those of you who've had a chance to see the first 2 episodes of Belly of the Beast, the new documentary, which I'd really recommend if you haven't had a chance, you see in the second part, the compañero with the prosthesis, who his whole life is limited because he can't get, a leg prosthesis that he needs to have more of a normal life. This is happening, everywhere in the country, and it's forced the Cubans to do things that they don't want to do. So for example, the whole question of tourism. Cuba has had to rely too heavily on tourism when they're allowed to have tourists. So let's say from the period of December 2014, when Obama said he was, in quotes, going to start normalizing relations with Cuba, which of course never happened, there was the expansion of tourism, and that's positive in the sense of more people get to go to Cuba, they get to interact with the Cubans, they see the benefits of the revolution. But it's not positive if a certain percentage of your entire economy has to be based on tourism. And tourism, particularly, from the global north, but even from the global south, brings consequences. Like it brings an increase in prostitution, even of teenagers, which of course was one of the most important things that the revolution attacked once it took power. So, you know, then we had times where Raul Castro's son went around the world about 8 or 9 years ago saying, oh yeah, we're going to build more golf courses to have more tourists. So, you know, it creates all kinds of contradictions. But I think overall, the fact of the blockade is that we need to work together to bring it down. And first and foremost, as Malcolm said, people need to understand why it's a blockade. You know, we have a lot of people, I think more older people, more tendency to be white people in our movement around Cuba who don't want to use the word blockade. And there's a big sign, I'm sure people have seen it. When you walk out of the Jose Marti airport, you open the doors and it says in Spanish, you know, bloqueo, genocidio, you know, genocidal blockade. And that's what the blockade is. It's killing people every day in Cuba, you know, chemotherapy for cancer. You know, people can't get all the chemotherapy they need. Cuba has an incredible health system, but it can only go so far. And there are certain things that it does need to be able to buy. And just like Malcolm said, the fact that they have to go all the way to Vietnam and China to get things like rice costs them an enormous amount of money and time that they shouldn't have to be spending their money on.
Thank you, Howard. Yeah, I definitely agree with the self-sufficiency too. It's funny, like, again, going off of my experience there, seeing the self-sufficiency and seeing the innovation, the creativity and innovation as well out there too, in different communities that we were able to visit. It reminded me a lot of our Pueblo people, you know, reminded me a lot of even seeing the farming equipment was really cool, even especially relating it back to the Cuban Revolution, how the tractors were turned into tanks during the revolution. That was super, super awesome to see. But definitely do agree on the innovation, the creativity, the self-sufficiency, and in many ways, the example of what it looks like for an entire country, you know, an entire people, entire society to be living in the way that they want to be living, you know, amongst all of these attacks, amongst all of the amongst the blockades as well, you know. Stella, Roberto, is there anything that you would like to add?
I can add something, yes. And these attacks aren't anything about Democrats or Republicans, the administrations we've had since the Cuban Revolution of '59. We can very well remember in 1962, under John F. Kennedy, the Democratic president, the Cuban Missile Crisis. They almost started a world war. The Soviet Union was supporting Cuba. The US made a deal finally to get the missiles out of Cuba if the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, if the United States got rid of some of their military missiles and stuff in Eastern Europe. And at that time, the United States had a contingency plan if there was going to be a war, that there would be biochemical warfare against the Cuban people before an armed attack on Cuba. And that's documented, you know, so, and this has been going on for a long time, this kind of biochemical warfare, you know, so it's just really insidious and nasty and has no boundaries.
Yeah, I'll add that I feel like I think of the attacks on Cuba from the US in 3 or 4 different categories, which are the blockade, the occupation of Guantanamo, the news that the US spreads here that's very harmful and false, and then the physical attacks that the various attacks that the US has launched on Cuba. And, you know, I feel that we saw a lot of the effects of the occupation of Guantanamo when we visited. And, you know, it's such a testament to hear that the US has been sending this check to Cuba for $4,800 every year, and Cuba rejects the check every year. in addition to that, you know, when we were in Cuba, there was someone who was living in Cuba on the trip with us who explained that they've lost crops, orange crops, from biological warfare at the hands of the U.S. You know, Fidel, there were many attempted assassinations on Fidel. I think I learned from Malcolm 638. Is that number right, Malcolm? Okay, close, but still a crazy amount. And you know, so many different tactics, and just you know, a lot of various tactics and angles of attacks that that are widespread and have been going on for many years.
If I can just add something real quick, there was one U.S. plan to get chemicals onto Fidel Castro where he would lose his beard, because they thought without his beard he'd lose popularity in Cuba and Cuba would fail. Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know what category to put that one in.
Yeah, that's a whole other category for U.S. imperialism.
I am so glad that you raised the occupation of Guantanamo, because it is separate from the blockade, precedes the blockade, right? Is, you know, 120 years now, basically, that the U.S. has maintained that illegal occupation. And as you were saying, right, the effects of that are like very wide ranging there. I've had the privilege to be able to visit Guantanamo, the province, the city, and some of the municipalities that are closest to the base in the last few years. And you hear about the provocations for violence, right? The kind of like border skirmish kind of things that take place along the edges of the U.S. base. And then it's the deepest port, or it would be the deepest port in Cuba. It would be, you know, as significant as the ports that they have around Havana. And so there's a huge economic loss that they suffer from that. Their fishing industry is affected by it. And then just like on a very human level, you talk to people who live in Guantanamo and they tell you they have to drive hours to go to a beach for recreation when they could be accessing the water right there. So I'm really glad you raised that. And as others have mentioned, you know, the terrorism, the violence that's been perpetrated against Cuba. And I just also want to add, you know, part of it is also attacks on the solidarity movement, is another way that Cuba is attacked, ranging from literal assassinations, although that hasn't happened in a while. There have been assassinations of people who arranged travel to Cuba. And as recently as 2011, a travel agency in Miami got firebombed, right? Because they arranged travel to Cuba. And I think I just heard just a couple of weeks ago, a comrade in Miami who's been organizing solidarity work there has been receiving death threats and all of these things. So it goes really deep, yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you for sharing that, y'all. Especially, yeah, thank you, Stella, for raising those as well. Even thinking about the news that reaches us here, you know, in the belly of the beast, how many lies are portrayed, how many lies are told, even before going out there too, folks at home, you know, thinking about it. A lot of just like, a lot of unreal facts or things that were made up, you know. So I think that's also another thing we can think of too when it comes to that solidarity being created, and those efforts as well as being able to truth tell, you know, really break down those lies and explain and show people that that's not what it is. You know, Cuba is one of the first places to be thinking about humanity. You know, even the examples now during this global pandemic, going to over 24, 23 different countries, you know, to help, to aid, even being told not to come to the US, even not just this year, but even before, in terms of when there was the humanitarian aid, you know, after the hurricanes and Katrina, things like that. So Howard, I seen you had your hand up. Or something you wanted to add?
Well, I just wanted to elaborate on what a really good point you made, Sheldon, about how the blockade hurts the people in the United States. One of my kind of goals is to try to get more and more people, not to support, to support the idea of, yes, people should go to their Congress people or their city council and pass resolutions about the blockade and try to get as many people in Congress to vote against the blockade. That's all important. But we need to see that our futures, as people in this country before COVID and now more than ever with COVID, is dependent on really developing a revolutionary mass movement that's going to be in solidarity with the Cuban people and the Cuban government, primarily of working class people and people of color. So we've got to do a lot more work of talking about how the blockade is hurting people in our communities and in our workplaces, right? So that means everything from the world's biggest, most successful literacy program ever, that started in the year 2000, that exists in about 33 countries, that has helped 12 million people read and write at a 6th grade level. And we have 1 out of 4 people born in the United States who cannot read and write at a 6th grade level. The health stuff I think we all know about, and I'm really glad you raised, Sheldon, the whole idea of diabetes. This year, by December 31st, we're going to have 80,000 people who will lose their foot and or leg to diabetic amputations. The racial ratio disparity is 3 to 1, 3 times more African Americans, 3 times more Latinx, and 3 times more Native Americans have amputations than whites due to diabetes. And the fact that, Cuba has a medicine, I'm sure you're familiar with, Herbiprot P, that could save, 80% of them from having amputations, is the kind of stuff we've got to really develop a much more strategic approach to, in our country, because it's only going to be, people who are outside of our movement, who don't come to our conferences for whatever reason, or our demonstrations or whatever, to see why it's in their interest, to be in solidarity with the revolution of the Cuban people that's going to bring down the blockade.
Thank you, Howard. Perfect segue into the next question, actually, is how can people show up in solidarity with Cuba from the US?
Okay, I'll start it off. Go to Cuba. Let's go. Like I said, last year we had our 50th contingent of Venceremos Brigade, and that was really successful. It was a wonderful trip. Met some really wonderful people from the US and Cuba all over the place, of course. But obviously for next year, it doesn't look like we can organize anything right now with the current COVID situation and everything. But keep your eyes and ears open. There's other ways, not just with the Venceremos Brigade, to go to Cuba. IFCO Pastors for Peace, they send people. There's different groups that send people to Cuba. So just keep your eyes and ears open and go to Cuba. See it for yourself. Behind me here is in La Habana at the Plaza de la Revolucion. This is one of the May Day parades where they would usually have 1 million people during the May Day parades. So, go see Cuba yourself. It's an amazing, amazing experience.
Thank you, Roberto. Malcolm, Stella.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Well, one thing I learned from a presentation actually Oni gave to the brigade is to show up when you're asked and leave when you're not needed anymore, and to come in as equals, not saviors. And these are things that not only are important to our struggle, but also we've learned from the Cubans and how they show solidarity with other countries. And in addition to that, I think as simple as it sounds, I feel really important to spread the truth about Cuba that we know from what we've seen. you know, people talk a lot about having conversations with your family about race and politics, and I think the same goes for Cuban solidarity. I didn't know that, like, my dad has a very different conception of Cuba than I do, and so just having conversations with people who have never been to Cuba and have been fed the story of what the U.S. Has been telling for so many years that villainizes Cuba and that just recreates history in their favor. So I feel that to me, a really important act of solidarity is telling the truth that I've seen with my own eyes from going to Cuba and heard from the Cuban people is really important.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Stella. Malcolm, if you can go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm having a little internet connection issues, so let me know if you can't hear me at some point. But definitely support what I've heard that's been said. You know, unfortunately, it's hard. Like, Cuba really needs material support, and because of the blockade, it's really tough to do. But I will selfishly, you know, say donate to the brigade if you can. I'm throwing the link in the chat right now. We can accept donations, and we appreciate it, and it helps us to keep this work happening. And, you know, part of what we do when we travel to Cuba is to bring as much aid as we can. And so that will support that kind of work. I think what's been said about sharing info and, you know, countering the disinformation campaign is really key. You know, promoting the kind of stuff like the Belly of the Beast series, getting that out there to the widest audience possible is really huge. And then there are a number of campaigns ongoing to support Cuba politically. There's a campaign currently to try to get the Henry Reeve brigades, the Cuban doctors who are traveling around the world treating COVID and so many other things, to get them awarded the Nobel Prize. I can try to pull some links for these things. There's a campaign called the Saving Lives campaign, speaking a little to what Howard said earlier around medical collaboration between the US and Cuba. And there's an effort to get as many cities across the country to pass resolutions. There are labor councils passing resolutions in support of ending the blockade. So checking out what's going on locally and trying to work on that is what I would say.
Awesome. Thank you, Malcolm. Howard, is there anything you wanted to add as well?
I would just say it's really good that Malcolm and other people have talked about, and also Roberto, of, like, you know, we don't know what's going to happen next year, but it may not be able to organize groups like the VB to go to Cuba, but I think we need to start preparing for when that day happens again. And one of the things I think we need to sort of figure out is that mainly, I think unconsciously, we're kind of in a situation where it's kind of difficult on a lot of these trips for working class people to go, like, let's say, for 2 weeks. You know, before COVID, you know, it's like, as we know, most people in the United States have no vacation guaranteed. You know, that's a privilege. It's becoming more and more of a privilege, even before COVID. So I think we have to figure out, like Roberto was saying, how do we get people to Cuba, but not just anyone? Because even at the beginning of the VB, but particularly lately, it's more kind of, to a certain extent, except for some of the youth that VB brings and some of the youth that other groups bring, kind of a privileged group that's going to Cuba a lot. I mean, they're great people, they're dedicated, they're in solidarity with the revolution, that's all positive. But we've really got to figure out how each one of the trips, Pastors for Peace, the VB, you know, whatever other groups are going that we think are progressive, we have to figure out how's that going to work for working class people, particularly of color in the US, to be able to go. So that's one thing. The second thing is, when we do, or as we are bringing down the blockade, we've got to think about, like, are there projects that are longitudinal that we can do together with the Cubans. So that could mean Cubans coming here, which probably is not going to happen until after the blockade, although it happened with a group of Cuban doctors and nurses in Chicago, but that was the exception, or people going there. So we've developed a project which kind of got caught up in some of the difficulties in Cuba of people who grow food in the US, small group of people, like 20 people going to Cuba. And at the invitation of the Cubans in Santiago de Cuba to work directly with small farmers and campesinos to really exchange information using popular education, using farmer to farmer, of how people are dealing with things like climate change in Cuba, climate change in the US. So I think we got to think of more projects like that that potentially could work. Not just people going for a week or 2 weeks and coming back getting all excited, and then what,
For sure. Yeah, the next question as well. Also being too somebody who traveled with the VB as well, and even thinking about now how we have had the New Mexico VB established too for many years, and also building on it too, creating that solidarity, that real relationship building, Shout out to everybody from Belly of the Beast, from ECAP, all of the relatives, good folks, good family, sharing. There was actually an evening there too that we spent with some folks here. Good Tiwa's sister of mine, Julia Bernal. We had a great evening there one night and just kind of spent like cultural sharing, from folks from ECAP too, and talking about struggles and sharing struggles, even sharing triumphs. We're able to share even as well as stories, a couple stories too about our Pueblo Revolution, the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, and thinking about ways how we can keep coming together through solidarity, through unity, which also leads me into the next question too of that truth telling, right? And really dismantling the lies that have been spread here in the belly of the beast. So the next question being, where can people find accurate information about what's really happening in Cuba?
It's not easy. No, I mean, it's not that difficult either, but just don't expect to see anything accurate in any of the mainstream press, really. Although there's the occasional, thing that they have to admit to, right? When they have to recognize the truth. I think I saw something recently in the New York Times was writing about how Brazil fucked up so bad with COVID. And part of their story they had to tell was that they kicked out 10,000 Cuban doctors from the country when Bolsonaro came to power. And what are the ramifications of that? Anyway, that's a little tangent, right? Even the mainstream media occasionally has to admit the reality. But I'll drop some more links in the chat. There are many Cuban publications that I suggest following. And then there are some US-based ones as well that work with Cubans to make sure that accurate information gets out there. So I'll put some links in the chat, but I'm also curious to hear what others have to say.
I'll jump in. Yeah, when I first saw this question, I was saying to Oni, I don't know how to answer that. And then I realized it's because the way I learn information about Cuba is just so different than the way I learn or the way I look up information about things in the US. So in addition to coming to events like these, which is where I've learned most information, it is honestly from individual conversations with people on the brigade and with people in Cuba. But in addition to that, it's honestly looking up old translated speeches of Fidel and Che is a really great resource, as well as books written by Fidel and Che and other Cuban revolutionaries. I feel like those those are the only ones I can think of. But I'm excited to see the links Malcolm drops in the chat, because there aren't many publications that I've been able to find when I try to Google something.
Nice. Yeah, awesome. Thank you, y'all. Even, yeah, definitely the links, definitely all the links help. The books help, definitely. Yeah, like Stella said, you know, being able to speak with people even on the brigade or there in Cuba, talking about different books to read. Even Roberto sometimes will be sharing too, even different shows, different movies that come up, you know, like I remember watching the Motorcycle Diaries in high school, you know, that was one of the first ways I was been able to be in knowledge or politicized about Cuba or about different folks, different leaders as well, different efforts too, even shows, I would say as well. Roberto, Howard, do you have anything to add? Roberto, I think you're on mute.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Of course, if you're on Facebook, you know where our site is. You found us, and you can continue to get information from us. We have our monthly meetings like this where we do educational panels or topics, and we invite you to join that. And then also there's Granma. You know, the link is on the chat. Granma newspaper comes directly from Cuba. It comes in English and Spanish, so you can check that out. I mean, that's the best information you can get, obviously.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. There's actually a question from the audience. I'll go ahead and read. What would a curriculum for a proper education on Cuba look like? And how can this be taught in schools?
Malcolm?
Sure. I mean, I've got some experience with teaching about Cuba in the classrooms I work in. I mean, I'm going to give the kind of the long way there, but you know, all my teaching begins with laying a foundation around understanding power and being able to analyze who has power and what kind of power in a given situation. And then, you know, building off of that to understand economic systems, right? Like understanding what is capitalism, how does it function, what is socialism, and doing that honestly. And then I think what I've had the most success in, and as part of teaching the difference between capitalism and socialism as economic systems, and then what are the political formations that that are built out of those economic systems. I did a unit where we compared the Cuban Constitution with the U.S. Constitution. Right, and what do you see? What do you notice immediately in the Cuban Constitution is that there are really bold statements about, you know, people having the right to work, having food be a right, housing be a right, all these kinds of things that I think, as you know, many young people immediately kind of connect with. It's almost just like intuitive when you speak to somebody. Do you think, you know, people have the right to a home? Yeah, most of us probably do, but even though we've been conditioned to, you know, to think otherwise, maybe. And you know, then you look at the U.S. Constitution and how much it's all about property rights and individual liberties, so to speak, that are only meaningful if you have property, right? So getting to look at those kinds of things, getting to compare. Again, I really just like doing a lot of kind of comparisons between, and it's not always the best to do U.S. and Cuba comparisons, because, you know, the size, and, you know, Cuba is a colonized country and the U.S., yes, was colonized and now is a colonizer. And you know, so I work specifically with a lot of immigrants from the Caribbean. And so comparing Cuban history with, you know, the history of the Dominican Republic or the history of Puerto Rico, places that have similar histories in terms of colonization and development up, you know, until the 20th century. And then there's this really clear difference in the conditions there today. So doing those kinds of things, you know, looking at like hurricane response. There's some really easy and I don't know how to put it, just like shocking ways, you know. Look at what we see on the news when a hurricane is coming towards a city in the US, right? What mostly you're gonna see people telling you, go to the store. You better stock up on XYZ, on bottled water and batteries, and get a flashlight and get this and get that. Consume. And you know, and then you can find a Cuban news broadcast for what it looks like when a hurricane is coming, when they mobilize, you know, their civil defense is what it's called, and are able to do, you know, these mass drills, mass evacuations, whatever is needed to preserve human life. So getting to do all of those kinds of comparisons in the context of a study of history and a study of ideology and all of these kinds of ideas that, for me, so much of it does come back to power. That's my little story on it. But unfortunately, I've never really developed a full curriculum on it. Maybe one day.
And if I may, you know, people out in Facebook Landia, send us your questions. We're getting ready to start slowing down on this. But I did want to see if Dr. Ehrman, if you mentioned you may want to say a few words about COVID in Cuba and maybe about the Nobel Peace Prize for the Cuban medical teams around the world. A couple minutes, please.
Sure. I think everybody probably knows what Cuba has done, which really no other country's ever done kind of in the history of nation states. You know, most time nation states, particularly from the global north, are going and oppressing people in the global south. And Cuba, whether it's the literacy program, its health programs for almost 60 years, and now COVID in particular, is showing there's another way that we can show our humanity, right? And so that's basically by, on the invitation, as Stella mentioned, Cuba doesn't like contact the president of a country and say, oh yeah, we'd like to send our brigade over there. No, it's on the invitation of those countries, whether it was Ebola in 2014 or, you know, this year COVID. And, you know, they basically have people who are already volunteering. This is something that, despite the US imperialist propaganda, every Cuban doctor or nurse or anyone else who's a health worker has to volunteer. They're not forced to do it. They basically get a certain training by volunteering. Some of these brigades or missions, is what the Cubans call them, are permanently in a country. Like, for example, Cuba had a couple hundred doctors and nurses in Jamaica before COVID and other countries. And then some of them are temporary, like the 33 brigades, Henry Reed brigades for COVID. And certainly they deserve the Nobel Prize because basically they've worked hand in hand, you know, with not just the doctors, but with the general population, with the other health workers, not just in hospitals, but out in their communities. And that's the thing that is socialism, you know, and Marxism in practice. The Cubans are totally different than Doctors Without Borders, Paul Farmer's group, Partners in Health, all these imperialist or semi-imperialist formation of doctors who go in, who really don't live with the people, who don't eat with the people, who don't really respect the culture. I mean, the way that the Cubans stopped the world from getting Ebola was because they didn't go in and said, oh, the fact that you go in and you wash your dead and you dress your dead before you bury them is wrong. No, they went in and observed, they listened, and they worked with people in the 3 West African countries to utilize all the strengths of their culture and not go in there and criticize them and tell them they were wrong for what they were doing. The other thing that the Cubans do that it's very different is that they want people to be self-sufficient, to have self-determination. And they, use their training to first learn from people, but also to teach them what they know. That's how Ebola got stopped. They taught hundreds and thousands of health workers in those 3 countries the way to manage it after they learned from them how they were doing it. So I think it's an incredible model. The Cubans did come to Chicago, the only time since the revolution in 1959 where it was in quotes legal. There was some positive things that happened from that. The Cubans wanted to do a lot more, but there was kind of a lot of bureaucracy to deal with here in the university that I'm part of. So, but I think there's tremendous potential there for all over the world, including the US.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I just want to again say thank you to everybody on here, to the panelists, everybody who shared. Huge shout out to everybody tuning in. I just want to read a couple comments as well from some of the live feeds. Good relative from ECAP, from the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples. Greetings from Cuba to all our friends in the US, especially all of those who are members of the solidarity movements, and even more to my dear friends from the Venceremos Brigade. Thank you so much. Thank you for so much love. I want to send a big hug to my dear friends from the BV, Stella, Sheldon, Malcolm, to all of you folks. So yeah, thank you. So much love to ECAP, so much love to everybody out there. Let's see, another one too. Another relative from ECAP. Greetings from Habana, there Malcolm. It says, thank you so much for the support and solidarity with Cuba. Venceremos. But yeah, thank you to everybody really helping, especially on the last question too, with the curriculum, the curriculum building, how to really implement that, especially speaking with folks too, and really building that. Another way we do that too with the New Mexico VB too is every last Wednesday of each month we're on here like this, doing forms of political education, forms of popular education. Really also has helped me being a part of this, help me learn and understand, break down, like Malcolm mentioned, those ideologies, those functions, and understanding those powers, the power dynamics and how it happened, what's going on, and then moving that further into how we can help, how we can build that solidarity. So yeah, again, I think we may be closing out and wrapping up if there are no more, and last words.
Para a nuestros compañeros en Cuba, bienvenido a esta página de Facebook. Gracias por venir y estamos en solidaridad con ustedes. Venceremos.
Venceremos. Hasta la victoria siempre.
Venceremos.
Thank you so much for organizing, for having us. Been great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Stella.
you so
Thank you,
much.
Malcolm. Thank you, Howard. We appreciate you. And of course, our guests are on Facebook with us. And of course, Sheldon and Onya, wonderful as always. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, y'all. This was incredible. Have a good night. I'm gonna stop this.
Bye.